Hello, good evening. We are doing the audit committee at Lyndonville Central School District. Today is April 12th, 2021. We have a short agenda. We're going to start. There's two components. The first is to review the claims auditor's information. Chris Barone. Chris, please use the mic too, if you would. Review your information. And then also the second agenda and last is that we have John Reckowitz from MMB auditing firm, and he's going to review the financial audit process that we are going to use for this year 2021 audit. So go ahead, Chris. Thank you.
Okay. Does everyone have a copy of my letter in the report? Okay. As you can see, there were over 600 claims since September. There were a few checks that we did have to avoid, and I outlined the reasons why. I don't know if anybody has any questions on those. In the federal fund, we had there was a mistake made with our cleaning, with our janitors. Accidentally, they threw away 2 of our invoices. We had to recreate those invoices, and checks did not have to be reprinted. They were already done. But according to the auditors, that's what they told Jen Button to do, so she did that. We had to make another warrant. That's something that had I don't remember ever happening, so that was new to me. The other things were just pretty common. Checks were lost. We reissued them. Check to the toy company was, they said they never received it, so we reissued a check. In the meantime, they had cashed the first check. They cashed the second check. They refunded us one of the checks. So that came out even. Other than that, everything seemed good this year. We still have bills. We still have payments. I think Jen and I still work real well together, and if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Just one real quick. When you made reference to the checks being voided, in each instance, I just want to make sure you found that stop payments were put into place.
Yes, they were.
Okay, thank you.
They were.
Yes. So
I make a motion we approve the claims auditor summary network report is printed.
Right.
Any questions or comments? All in favor?
All right. All right, that's all set. Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome.
You can stay if you like. Or if you choose.
I'm ready to go home.
Or you choose, you could leave as well. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Okay, the second and last item tonight is MMB, Mango Metzer Bar is our auditing firm. A subset of that was Ray Wager, still is Ray Wager. And John Reckowitz is with us this evening. He's going to do a quick overview of our audit process. And there's handouts on this as well. There's a handout on this as well. Thanks, John. Good evening.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm going to try and share my screen so we can go through the presentation. And it's just a brief overview of what we do in an audit. And hopefully you can see that. All right, so This is the audit planning meeting. So again, my name is John Rinkowitz. I'm from Engel Metzger Bar, the governmental division. So we audit many school districts, approximately 70 of those and 6 BOCES. So we're very familiar with the industry, and we'll be performing our audit procedures coming up this spring and in the summer. And just going to give you a quick walkthrough of those. Okay, so quick agenda, and just we'll be walking through all of these areas, and we can just hop right in. Scope of services. So what are the services we provide? Well, we perform an audit, and we do that so that we'll be able to provide you these items. So these are an expression of an opinion. So we complete our audit. There's a 70 or so page financial statement that comes with it. And that includes an auditor's opinion, which is about 3 pages long in the front of the report, which is an expression of opinion saying that the financial statements present fairly in all material respects the respective financial position of the district. Okay, so you pay a lot of money for 3 pages of paper, but it's an important service, and that's what we do. Your next is a second opinion. Now, so the school districts are required to report under, have an audit done under governmental auditing standards, and those standards require that we not only report on the financial statements and whether they're presented fairly, but we also are required to provide an opinion on your internal controls and your compliance with laws and regulations. So there's a separate opinion that you'll find in the back of the report that's a couple pages long. Okay. The next 2 bullets related to your federally funded programs. Now, in a typical year for this district, you wouldn't normally get these opinions because these are opinions that typically happen or items that typically happen related to the single audit of your federal programs, which is triggered when you receive more than $750,000 worth of federal aid. In a normal year, the district wouldn't be over that threshold. The anticipation is that this year, with the additional monies coming from the CARES Act, as well as additional monies being earned in the school lunch program because your students are being reimbursed at that higher rate because everyone's free this year, that you will trigger a single audit. So that's going to be an additional audit that we do. We're going to issue additional reports, and there will be a small additional fee on top of that. So that's a fee you normally wouldn't have had in prior years, but just to let you be aware that we will be doing that. And typically we do those after the conclusion of the audit. So the audit will be done over the summer. We'll issue reports in September, and then typically we'll come back in the October-November timeframe and complete the single audit. We also complete an audit of your extracurricular activities funds, and we issue a separate report on that, which is required by New York State. All right, management's responsibilities. So just your business office and the folks there, responsibilities here as listed, pretty straightforward. Establish and maintain those systems' internal controls. So develop those controls, having those financial records available to us, which your folks always do a great job meeting our needs. Posting adjustments when we identify any adjustments to be made, any corrections. Designing and implementing controls to prevent and detect fraud, and we'll talk about fraud in a little bit. Identifying, ensuring that you comply with laws and regulations. So school districts are pretty heavily regulated. So there's numbers of laws and regulations that you have to keep remain compliant with. So not only your federal monies, but general municipal law and local property tax law and education law in New York State. and then to follow up on any corrective action plan and reported audit findings. And again, this district does a very good job. We will issue as part of our report, or along with our report, a separate report letter, management letter we call it, with some recommendations of probably some improvements that can be made. And this district historically has done a very good job of addressing those recommendations. Audit approach. Okay, so going through an audit, we want to make sure we're focusing on what we call high-risk areas. So risk-based approach. So the more risky an area is, so higher dollars or more more things that could go wrong in those areas, are areas we're going to spend a little bit more time in. Those areas with lower dollars, or where it's unlikely that something could go wrong, we'll probably spend a little less time auditing, or less testing to be done. All right. And again, as I mentioned, we base a lot of our decisions on our knowledge, our experience with school districts, and we're pretty extensive there. We look for changes in key personnel or other restructuring, new activities or programs. So these things that have changed since last year, which could indicate a new risk that could be in place. Pandemic response. So still dealing with the pandemic and the changes to day-to-day life that have occurred as this has gone on. So we will understand any changes that have occurred in the business office and its operations and internal controls, and make sure that we consider whether we need to modify our audit procedures to properly address those. Working remote versus on-site. So our firm has been able to work remotely for a long time now. We've done a pretty significant investment in technology and training of our staff to allow them to work remotely. So when things were shut down last year, we were actually able to accommodate that pretty easily. And this district actually did a very good job of helping us out working remotely. But it's really up to the client. So what your folks are comfortable with, whether you want us on site or not, if you have the facilities to accommodate us. So it's really going to be up to you folks. Key controls. So again, to help us deal with risk and your internal controls, help mitigate risks. We identify what we call key controls. So you have many controls in place, separate sets of eyes on things, separate people doing functions in order to make sure that things are happening correctly, and that there are reviews, and those go down from the low, very bottom levels of employees all the way up through what we call entity level controls, the board level. So what's the board's participation in the operations of the district, reviewing financial results and approving contracts and rates and funding reserves and budgets and all those fun stuff that the board does. So we complete a walkthrough of your key controls. So a walkthrough is really just kind of taking transactions and walking them through the controls. Where can we see the key control activities? We look for any modifications that we need to make to our procedures to address, really identify and address those key controls. As part of our testing, if we note any breakdown of key controls, we'll make sure we're communicating those. And as I said, we'll provide you a management letter for any recommendations we might have for improvements. And we're going to focus on these significant audit areas. So these are areas you typically see in the financial statements, affecting the financial statements. And cash, obviously, and several purchasing, payroll. You can read these. Reserves and fund balance is an area we're actually going to talk a little bit about. Okay, so those are some areas that we'll focus on. Compliance, and again, as I mentioned, governmental auditing standards require that we test for compliance. So we'll look for your understanding and assessment of controls over compliance for your federal programs. as we're testing your internal controls, we're going to look to make sure that you're complying with the laws that you're subject to. So bidding and quoting, which is something that you're subject to. Uniform grant guidance, and that's again on your federal programs, making sure that you've implemented those policies and procedures over compliance with federal programs. And areas to monitor, so just some things that are going on, again, kind of new with the pandemic, school lunch claiming. So in the past, you had school lunch provides free, reduced, and full price meals, and each one of those generated at least some aid. In the current year, all school meals are all students are in that free category. Okay, so the claiming can be different because of that. We'll look at the new federal dollars in child nutrition, as I just mentioned, and CARES Act funds, right? So there's some educational stabilization funds that have been made available to districts, and those have specific compliance requirements. So we'll be looking for compliance with that. Fraud risk. So just kind of touch on fraud. So one of our requirements under our auditing standards is to address fraud. So we do some procedures to look to see if we see any indicators that fraud could be going on. And when we talk about fraud, we're talking about a couple different things: misappropriation of assets, so that, but also fraudulent financial reporting. Okay, so purposely misstating your financial reports, and we look for these characterizations in the folks working, rationalization, so justification of dishonest acts, opportunities, so breakdown of internal controls where which might allow a fraud to go on and be undetected. Personal pressure, so motive or incentive to commit fraud by employees. Management, again, is responsible for designing those programs that implementing those internal controls to not only prevent but detect fraud from occurring. Implement a process for individuals to report suspected fraud. So you've adopted a whistleblower policy to let people know that they should be reporting fraud without fear. On our end, we're going to be brainstorming. So we sit down, we have a meeting before we start the audit. Us auditors get together and we kind of brainstorm what could be an area where we see fraud that could happen. We're going to make interviews with your staff, management, and we actually ask very directly, are you aware of any fraud going on? Okay. And we'll review for any internal controls. We're looking for management override of internal control that might indicate an attempt to do something fraudulent. And we'll modify our procedures as necessary if we determine that there is some risk there or that potentially something has happened. As I mentioned earlier, fund balance and reserves. So this is an area in our audit we will spend some time on. It's really important as a matter of budgeting that districts are able to develop, establish, fund, and utilize their reserve funds. So it's kind of like having these savings accounts for specific purposes that the district has. And the way you utilize these really has to be with a long-term perspective. Because how they fit into the budget and when you use them and how you refund those is very important on a long-term basis. If you use all your money up in 1 year, it can lead to some difficulties in budgeting moving forward, because if that source of funding's gone, how do you replace it? So we have comparative balances. So this is where you ended up last year, 2020, and compared to the prior year. And you can see you have ended up actually pretty close overall from between your reserves and your unassigned fund balance and assigned fund balances. So your bottom line was pretty close. And in fact, is really only this close due to some timing that of some state aid that didn't come in as anticipated prior to year end. Okay. And as I mentioned, budgeting. So use of reserves to help you balance your budget. That's one of the things we're going to look at. So last year, for your 1920 budget, you can see the amount you used for reserves and fund balance to help you balance your budget. For 2021, you appropriated some additional amounts. So we're going to pay attention to that, right? Because if we start spending out of the reserves, which you can do, you want to make sure you've got a plan, a long-term plan on how you're going to start to reduce your reliance on those reserves. And some of this budgeting, this increase here is really related to some of the uncertainty you had at the end of last year. If you remember, the state had a plan for the CARES Act money, but it wasn't necessarily approved at the federal government level yet. So it was unclear how the state was going to implement those dollars. The state, as a cash flow measure to help with their cash flow, actually started to withhold 20% of your aids, your aid packages. So some of the aid you had outstanding as a receivable at your end, they were actually withholding 20% of that. That's been restored for the current year. So, and as well as some changes with the CARES Act money, which now they've got a good handle on and how that's going to be. So there were some difficulties projected last year that really haven't come to fruition, and you'll see how things have turned around a little bit in the current year. Okay. And we kind of talked about this, right? Or some of these items, make sure you have that long-term plan. The last two bullets here are really kind of important to focus on. So this year, if you're projecting a surplus, you're going to want to make sure that, so a surplus, so you've made money instead of lost money as projected due to, again, your aid coming in higher than projected and not having to rely on the reserves that you originally budgeted. If you have those surpluses and your unassigned is over that 4% limit, which is statutorily required under the property tax law, any of those additional surpluses you're probably going to be looking to put into your reserves. You're going to want to make sure you have a resolution passed prior to June 30 with what we call an up to an amount on there. So you're probably not going to know the exact amount of your surplus at year end. So you go to the board with resolutions that kind of open-ended, we're going to be able to fund, $100,000 into this reserve and up to $1 million into this reserve. So you give these kind of up to amounts. And then when the actual amounts come in, you'll figure or make the second resolution after year end that really just identifies the exact amounts. Okay. But important to have that in place prior to June 30. And we talked about a plan to reduce reliance on reserves and fund balance once you start using those. Okay. Other items that are going on. So again, the CARES Act funds. So those are available for this year. And so this is federal monies that came out as a result of the pandemic back last March. And the federal government's finally come out with good information and how these funds are to be used. And the way the state's implementing it is for the amount of money that you are going to be getting of this CARES Act, they're actually pulling out some money from other aid. Right. So it's kind of a net zero impact to you. And those monies will be reported in the general fund and they're available for specific costs. The next rounds of aid that came out, so the CRRSA Act and the American Recovery Act, the stabilization funds there. So those are going to be a little different. So the governor's proposed budget is very different than what got passed. Okay. So it's going to change the way those stimulus funds that I just mentioned, the way those are reported. These are going to be reported differently. So they're no longer going to make those deductions from your foundation aid for these funds coming in. And these new dollars will instead be presented in the special aid funds. So so different monies available and they'll be implemented differently. Unemployment expense. So this was a big concern at the end of last year and ongoing. So those districts were paying for folks that got laid off or otherwise unemployed. And you were paying those costs. And then in January, the Department of Labor issued an order which basically said you're no longer required to responsible for those costs, and going all the way back to March 9. Now, they haven't been completely clear on their plan and how you're going to recover those costs. They are asking districts to pay only 50% of their bills at this point. So it sounds like they're expecting this money to be repaid as a credit moving forward. But there's still some wiggle room there. We're not really sure where they're at just yet. They haven't finalized anything, but that's how they're doing it right now. Paid leave. So folks who that you're paying required to take leave as part of this pandemic may not be required to pay the employer's share of FICA. So there's some relief there on those dollars. Uniform grant guidance, and again, this the federal dollars is taking on a kind of a more importance at this district because you're going to be subject to the single audit. SED is out there doing some audits on these, and one of their focuses here are having procedural manuals in place, which so we're going to be looking to make sure that you've got written procedures over compliance. Maintenance effort calculations, so your calculations of how much you're spending on students, making sure that those haven't decreased just because you're receiving federal money. A separate thing that the SED is doing, the Smart School Bond funds. So you have those Smart School projects. They're out there doing audits of those funds. So we're making sure our districts have your information very well documented, your spending's documented, and matches your plan, and that those are in order in case you get audited. Cybersecurity, this is just an ongoing process. It's very important that we make sure that we have a process in place to assess risk, to address it, to look for instances where an attack could happen, has it happened, making sure we're assessing that, providing training to your staff, because those are the folks that are using your systems and your students, and just make them aware and provide them with a guide for best behaviors and best ways of doing things. So how are you monitoring, how are you documenting, how are you communicating? A couple other items. So just real quick, GASB 84, so the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, which sets the standards for how you record things, has come out with this statement. This is actually going to impact a couple of things on your in your financial statements. Basically, the way your scholarship funds are handled, but also your extracurricular activities. I'm planning on scheduling a meeting with Joe to kind of go through this process and making those determinations of how this will impact the district. So we'll do that for this year. Next year, leases. So they're implementing some changes to how leases will be handled, and that's effective next year. And the real important thing right now is really just kind of getting a good inventory listing of your leases that you do have out there. So are you leasing property? Are you leasing equipment? Understanding that so that they can be evaluated. Okay. So that's my presentation. Are there any questions on the audit or anything else I can answer?
John, we're all set then, it looks like. Any questions? All set. So again, thank you for your time. Well thought out, all this information, and I look forward to talking to you before you come out. It's going to be towards the end of June for the prelim. So we'll talk before then, right?
Absolutely.
So I appreciate your time. Thank you, John.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.